Preacher dropped his Bible, picked up a rifle, because evil branded its warning into her skin. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. He dropped the Bible and picked up a rifle because a knife-burned sentence on a stranger's skin proved that some prayers don't stop monsters. Under a sky bleached white by the West Texas sun, former preacher Elias Ward heard a thin breaking moan float from an abandoned barn. He'd been walking to keep distance from the whitewashed chapel that still carried his name, a place where the words he once thundered had dried to dust. The cry didn't sound like music or wind. It sounded like a person trying not to disappear. The barn sagged as if heat alone bent wood. Elias eased through a warped door. Dust turned in slow spirals where light knifed between boards. The air smelled of mice nests, old hay, and something sour that did not belong to animals. A loose rope tapped a post with a rhythm that made his shoulders tighten. He moved along the stalls until the moan came again, not loud, just unwilling to die. She lay half-curled on scattered straw wrists and ankles bound with coarse rope that had raised raw bands on her skin. Her dress, once the color of clean sky, had been dragged through fear and time until it held a darker shade. When his shadow crossed her, she flinched, then fixed him with a stare built of terror and stubbornness in equal measure. "I'm not here to hurt you," Elias said, choosing a tone that might settle a skittish cold. "Please, don't lift my skirt." The words broke at the edges, lips split, voice ragged. "All right," he answered and set the knife to her ankle ropes first. The hemp fought him like a bad memory, then gave. He cut the knots at her wrists, easing each turn to spare burned skin. When the last loop fell, she dragged breath like someone who'd forgotten how. The darker stain spreading up from the hem told the rest. He looked at her face so she could see his intent, waited out the tiny nod, then lifted the torn fabric with a care that felt almost like prayer. The letters weren't ink. They were carved shallow and sealed by heat. She saw too much. It was not a wound alone, it was a message. A man had used her body as a bulletin and expected the whole county to read. Who Elias kept a bandana pressed above the worst bleed in his voice even. Calder Pike, she whispered. His men. The name was all distance and money and cattle and a smile that never reached the eyes. Everyone in 3 towns knew it. Elias didn't think about Providence or sermons. He thought about the length of the road to his cabin and whether the clouds that looked like smoke were building into heat lightning. "We're leaving," he said. He lifted her carefully, one arm behind the shoulders, the other beneath the knees, and stepped into the blast of afternoon. The path north dog-legged along a dry creek bed, 2 miles of dust and mesquite. He kept a rhythm to his stride he could hold for a long time, not fast, not slow, steady enough that his breath didn't turn thin. Once she bumped his collarbone with her chin and hissed through her teeth. He adjusted his grip and said only, "Easy. I've got you." The cabin was a low rectangle tucked against a rise of rock cedar, dark at the door, one window giving to a world of heat shimmer. Inside smelled like coffee grounds, wood smoke, and a lone man's attempts at order. He laid her on the narrow cot and fetched water. She drank in small, careful swallows. He put a pot on to boil and spread cloth on the table with a method that belonged to another life before his faith frayed when he believed skill offered to suffering could be its own kind of prayer. "What's your name?" he asked, mostly to keep her anchored to the room. "Mara Quinn." "I'm Elias," he said. "You're safe here?" "For now," she said, not ungrateful, only honest. He cleaned what could be cleaned, bound, what must be bound, and turned from the branded words each time he felt his jaw harden enough to ache. He worked quiet, no pretty talk, just the simple reporting of facts. This will sting. Breathe. When the bleeding slowed to a stubborn ooze, he tore strips from an old shirt to make better dressings. He set herbs to steep because they were what he had. Willows along the creek gave him medicine and shade. Both had saved men before. Dusk softened the room. She slept in snatches that sounded like falling, waking with a start from places only she could see. Each time he was close enough for a palm on her shoulder so she wouldn't think she was alone. Through the open window, the steeple pricked the horizon like a lie told brightly. Elias watched the line where sky met scrub and let his mind clear until it held only two facts. Calder Pike did this, and Mara was breathing. He took the rifle from its hooks and laid it on the table, not as a threat, not as a symbol, but as a tool. He broke it down, cleaned fouling that hadn't had reason to be scrubbed in months, oiled metal until it shone like a promise. The habit returned to his hands like a hymn he'd learned as a boy and never entirely forgot. There were no verses. There was only the patient click of parts finding home. When the last light thinned to violet, he stepped outside, listened for what didn't belong. Hoofbeats voiced the particular clink of stirrup against spur that carries farther than a man thinks. The land exhaled old heat. Far off, a coyote laughed at something private. Elias went back inside, checked the latch, settled in the chair near the door, and let the steady draw of air through the chinks in the wall count time. He had nothing to say to God and nothing to say to the chapel. He did have something to say to Pike, and it would not be delivered with words. The message carved into Mara's skin had arrived. His answer would be written on different material. When Mara stirred again, he lifted the cup to her mouth, and as she drank he found his purpose shrinking to the size of the room and hardening like tempered steel. Keep her alive, make the next hour safe, then the next. Outside, the night settled. Inside, the man who left the pulpit found the work he meant to do. The cabin woke to heat and small sounds, wood ticking a fly testing the window, the kettle's first whisper. Elias washed his hands in boiled water and set the lamp so light pooled over clean cloth. "Tell me where it's worst," he said. Shoulder Mara answered, "and the cut pulls when I breathe too deep." He unwound yesterday's bandage with the patience of someone working around a fault line. The wound looked less angry. He told her so, and a tightness left her jaw. He cleaned with willow and water-pressed fresh cloth where the bleeding looked ornery, and tied off the wrap in a square knot that wouldn't slip. They learned each other's silences. He didn't fill space with comfort he didn't trust. She didn't pretend she was fine when she wasn't. When he offered the cup, she drank. When he asked to check the brand near her collarbone, she turned just enough. The scar sat high and puckered a bar laid across a P ownership boiled into flesh. "Pike's men," he asked. "Nash Crow," she said. "Reeves Dalton." A big one they called Ox Holt March. She gave the names like measurements exact, not dramatic. Elias repeated them, letting each settle. He set the rifle on the table and field stripped it with the calm of a chore metal, clicking in a rhythm his hands remembered. By noon, she could sit propped against the wall. He cooked a thin broth from onion, carrot, and a scrap of jerky. When he turned to bring it, she lifted her own hand. "You eat first," she said. He obeyed because small trusts are not to be wasted. Later, she mapped the room with her eyes' knife marks and the table soot print over the stove, a porcelain doll chipped to a permanent half-smile. She touched the doll once, then set it back as if deciding not to carry what wasn't hers. Elias counted cartridges and matches, tore old cloth into neat strips, set a full bucket by the door in case sparks jumped. He oiled the back latch and wedged a sliver of mesquite high in the door jamb, a sentinel that would fall if the door moved. Her strength returned in careful inches. On the day she swung both legs over the cot without asking for his arm, she smiled, startled by joy. He put a chair in the doorway so she could sit in the shade and watch heat shimmer across scrub. The steeple bit bright into the afternoon. "Why the church?" she asked quietly, "if you don't feel it any more?" "Habit," he said, aligning the rifle bolt. After a beat, and I kept hoping the words would come back if I stood where I used to say them. They didn't. "What did?" "This," he said, not lifting the weapon like a banner. "Showing up with both hands for what's in front of me." "That I believe in," she answered. He taught her small defenses without drama. How to hold a knife so the edge works and your thumb doesn't slice. How to move close, not wide. Down and across, he said, demonstrating a short, ugly arc. Closer is safer than you think. She practiced wrist loose, shoulder steady, repeating the motion until muscle learned what fear forgets. They walked behind the cabin at dusk, 2 fence posts for distant shade enough to protect stitches, wind enough to feel alive. On the 4th evening, she reached the 2nd post and laughed, then clapped her hand to her mouth, embarrassed by the sound. He nodded as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world to reclaim laughter. Sleep didn't always hold. Some nights she jerked awake from places that were not this room. He kept water on the table, a wool shirt within reach for the shakes, and the sentence he could say without lying, "You're not there." She'd blink back to the lamplight and nod once as if that single fact could be enough for now. On a late afternoon, when clouds made a brass-colored sky, she told him the reason Pike had carved words into her skin. She'd witnessed justice done the way a ledger man does, it quiet, efficient punishing. "He saw me see him," she said. "Some men fear a witness more than a gun." She didn't weep when she spoke. She rationed breath like a resource and refused to spend more than the story cost. They set a plan. If riders came from the west, she'd slip out the back and cut along the dry creek under willow shade. From the south, she'd work the boulders and vanish up the sheep trail. He showed her the floorboard that lifted without squeal, the pouch of cartridges, the second knife tucked beneath the table lip. They rehearsed the motion slowly until the steps lived in muscle and not in panic. The land exhaled evening. Elias checked the perimeter quail tracks, lizard whips a coyote's neat stitch, no horseshoes yet. He doused the lamps and let the room find a soft dark where shapes told the truth of themselves. He sat near the door rifle at thigh, listening to small sounds that mean a place is still yours. The light scrape of a beetle and ash cloth settling 2 human breaths, moving in and out without hitch. He didn't pray. He kept watch. The steeple, if he'd gone outside to look, would have been a pale tooth against a darkening sky. Inside, the work was simple and exacting. Keep the sliver in the jam. Keep water hot and the rifle clean. Keep the next hour safe. Far-off wind worried mesquite into a dry whisper. Closer, the woman he'd carried 2 miles shifted in sleep and did not startle. Elias let the sound of that quiet settle into his chest. He didn't know when men would come, only that they would. When they did, the answer would be ready. The first warning was not sound, but dust. A faint smear rose on the horizon, twisting in the hard light, like smoke from a dying fire. Elias leaned against the doorway rifle, resting easy at his thigh, and watched the clouds stretch and darken. Mara, inside, felt it too. She pushed herself from the chair skirt, hem tucked up to free her steps, and drew the knife he had taught her to hold steady. Neither spoke. Both understood. 3 riders took form out of the shimmer. Nash Crow led slouched in the saddle with the careless ease of a quick trigger. Beside him rode Reeves Dalton, lean and sharp-eyed, a man who measured every step. Behind them loomed Holt Ox March, thick as a wall, his horse laboring beneath him. Dust swirled around them as they reined up 20 yards away. They didn't look like men testing the water. They looked like men sent to finish work. Crow lifted his chin. Ward, he called, voice dry as mesquite. "We're here for the girl. Send her out, and maybe we don't tear down your shack." Elias stepped forward, boots crunching grit. "You've got the wrong place." Reeves chuckled low. "Funny thing, the boss's ledger says she's right here." "The ledger lies," Elias replied flatly. "Turn back or lay down your irons. Those are your choices." Crow's grin stretched. "You used to beg folks to bow their heads. Now you're begging us." His hand hovered near his revolver. "Preacher, we didn't ride out here for a sermon." The moment stretched the land holding its breath. Then Crow moved a blur of leather and steel. Elias's rifle snapped up in one smooth arc. The crack split the heat. Crow pitched sideways, revolver tumbling from his hand hat, rolling across the dirt. He tried to rise, breath ragged, then collapsed still. Reeves fired back, wood exploding from the doorframe. Elias dropped behind cover, chambered again, and returned fire steady, not rushed. Reeves slid off his horse, scrambling for the corral post. His hat brim shadowed eyes that darted quick, calculating angles, looking for advantage. Mara was already moving. She slipped out the back door, circling along the rocks until she could see Reeves side on. Heart hammering, she crouched low and waited. He leaned out to take another shot at Elias. That was enough. Mara rushed forward, knife angled short. She struck as he turned down and across, just as Elias had taught. His shot went wild, the pistol flying as blood welled hot at his throat. He staggered, choking, then dropped. Mara wrenched free hand steady despite the tremor in her chest. Meanwhile, Ox barreled straight for the cabin, massive frame hunched low, using his horse as cover. Elias heard the pounding hooves and shifted. He crossed the room in 3 strides, rifle ready. The back door shuddered under Ox's weight as he slammed it, hinges groaning. Mara, circling back, threw her shoulder into the plank from outside at the same moment, and the sudden give pulled Ox forward off balance. Elias met him in the gap. Ox swung a fist heavy enough to crush bone, but Elias stepped inside the arc too close for brute strength. They collided, chest to chest, grunting, the doorway splintering around them. Elias jammed his shoulder under Ox's arm, pressed the rifle barrel to his gut, and fired. The blast inside the cabin was deafening. Ox's eyes went wide, his mouth opened for a roar that never came, and then he collapsed backward, shaking the ground when he landed. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the snort of a riderless horse and the rasp of their own lungs. Mara stood near the corral knife, wet eyes scanning for more. Elias held his rifle, tight breath burning in his throat. 3 men had come. 3 men would not ride back. They didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They fetched the shovels from the lean-to and set to work. Hardpan earth fought them, each stroke a battle of its own. Sun pressed down without mercy. Sweat stung their eyes, and the smell of churned dirt mingled with iron and leather. They dug 3 pits side by side, wide enough to take the weight. They laid Crow first still with that crooked grin frozen half-made. Reeves, next eyes glassy blood drying dark. Last came Ox, heavy as stone, his bulk requiring both to drag him across the dirt. Not a word passed between them. The sound of earth falling onto bodies was enough. Thud after thud until the mounds rose level with the plain. No markers, no prayers, just silence. When it was done, Elias leaned on the shovel hands blistered raw. Mara tamped the last mound flat with the back of the blade. They stood together staring down, not in triumph, but in grim necessity. A buzzard circled high, sensing what lay beneath. Elias spat into the dirt. "Let the earth take them," he said. Back in the cabin, they washed in a basin until water ran brown. Elias cleaned the rifle with slow precision metal shining under the lamplight. Mara wiped the knife, wrapped it back in cloth, and sat by the door. Their eyes met across the small room. No words were needed. Finally, Mara broke the quiet. "They would have kept coming," she whispered. "They still might," Elias answered. His tone was steady, not cruel. But not these three. The room felt smaller now, but heavier, truer. Outside, 3 fresh mounds waited under the stars. Inside, 2 survivors sat with weapons near at hand, scarred but alive. For the first time since he had carried her from the barn, Mara allowed her eyes to close without flinching. Elias set the mesquite sliver back into the jam, settled into the chair by the door, and listened to her breathing settle into the rhythm of rest. The preacher, who once prayed for mercy, now kept watch with rifle and silence. And in that silence, the night stretched long, carrying the promise of more battles, but also the fact that for now they had survived. The graves were still raw when the real danger arrived. Calder Pike did not thunder in with a posse nor announce himself with gunfire. He came alone, riding slow posture, tall arrogance draped across him like a second coat. The late sun caught the silver trim on his vest and turned it into a glint that burned the eyes. Mara saw him first through the narrow window, and the blood left her face. Elias stood from the chair rifle already in his hands. He did not ask if she was ready, he knew. She was beside him, with the knife grip steady despite the tremor running through her shoulders. Together they stepped into the doorway, the cabin at their backs, the fresh mounds of dirt behind them still dark against the plain. Pike reined up and smiled thin and cold. "Well," he drawled, voice smooth as polished wood, "I see my men didn't come back. You've gone and made a mess of my books, preacher." Elias didn't answer. He held the rifle at an easy angle muzzle just low enough not to call it a threat, but not low enough to pretend peace. "You should have walked away," Pike continued. "She was nothing. Just a warning carved neat a note meant to be read and forgotten. But you." He shook his head, feigning pity. "You've made yourself part of the story." Mara's voice cut in rough but sharp. "You branded me like cattle. You thought I'd lie down in the dirt and stay there. You were wrong." Pike's eyes flicked to her surprise, flashing just once. Then he laughed the kind of sound men make when they think the world is theirs. "Girl, you think one knife and one worn-out preacher change anything? My herd covers half this land. My men fill the saloons from here to San Angelo. When I say a word, folks jump. When I mark flesh, it stays marked. That's the way of it." Elias stepped forward, closing the distance by a measured pace. Not today. Pike dismounted, boots hitting dirt with a practiced ease. He let his coat fall open, showing the revolver heavy on his hip. His hand hovered, taunting, daring. "Let's settle it, then. Pulpit against prophet. See which one buries who." The wind died. The plain seemed to hold its breath. Pike went for his iron fast as a whip crack, but Mara moved faster. While his hand cleared leather, she lunged from Elias's side knife, flashing low. The blade sank deep into Pike's ribs, angled up and true. His shot never came. He staggered, disbelief painting his face, and clawed at her shoulder. She twisted, shoved, and the steel cut deeper. Elias was there an instant later, rifle raised but unneeded. Pike gasped, knees buckling, and dropped to the dirt beside the fresh mounds where his men already lay. Blood soaked into the soil as he twitched once, then went still. Silence wrapped the cabin. A crow called from somewhere far off, breaking the spell. Elias lowered the rifle, the weight heavy but steady in his hands. Mara stepped back, breathing hard, the knife trembling only now that the fight was over. They did not speak. Together, they dragged Pike's body to the row of graves. The shovels bit earth again, each scoop heavier than the last. Sweat slicked their backs, the smell of iron and soil rising around them. When the pit was filled, Elias tamped it flat. No marker, no prayer, just another mound in a line of 4. He stood, staring toward the distant steeple. Its white paint caught the last light sharp against the darkening sky. Once it had been a beacon. Now it felt like a lie. He had spoken forgiveness there, begged men to turn cheeks they didn't have to spare. But standing over Pike's grave, he felt no forgiveness, no triumph, only clarity. Back inside, the cabin felt changed. The walls seemed to press closer, holding in heat, holding in truth. Mara picked up the chipped porcelain doll from the shelf and studied its face a long moment. Then she set it back gently, as if closing the door on something that no longer owned her. Elias sat at the table, cleaning dirt from his hands. He looked at her across the room. "It's done," he said. She shook her head. "It's not. There'll be whispers, maybe more riders, but the ledger's torn." "Then we move," Elias answered. At dawn, they packed what little they owned, rifle knife water, a bundle of cloth. The air was cool, the sky washed pale. Mara stood in the doorway a final time, looking at the cabin, the graves, the land that had nearly buried her. Her eyes didn't flinch. She turned to Elias. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. Together, they stepped into the open plain. Behind them, the church steeple shone like a false promise. Ahead stretched a horizon with no map, only the hush of wind and the long road of survival. They didn't speak of justice. Justice had never been offered to people like Mara. Elias no longer prayed for it. He carried purpose instead, scarred and solid. She carried scars that spoke not of shame, but of defiance. They weren't saints, weren't lovers, but something harder, truer, 2 people who had faced cruelty and chosen not to bow. As they walked, the dust rose behind their boots, erasing the trail. No farewell, no vow, just silence. And in that silence, something sacred stirred, not born of sermons or scripture, but of action and resolve. Dawn spread slow across the plains, washing the sky in pale silver and gold. Elias and Mara walked in silence, the cabin shrinking behind them with every step. The graves were nothing but dark mounds against the earth, now unmarked and already blending with the land. The steeple of the church still stood in the distance, a thin white needle cutting the horizon, but neither looked back. They had buried more than bodies there. They had buried the last remnants of who they used to be. The road ahead was long and uncertain. Their boots struck rhythm into the dust, steady, deliberate. They carried little a rifle cleaned to near perfection, a knife wrapped in cloth, a canteen and a satchel of torn bandages. Enough to survive, not enough to weigh them down. The land around them was empty, but not hollow. It held the sound of wind, the whisper of grass bending, and the unspoken vow between 2 people who had decided that survival itself was defiance. By midday, the sun pressed hard. They stopped at a low ridge where a thin trickle of water seeped between rocks. Mara knelt, filled the canteen, and washed her hands until the bloodstains faded. She looked at her scars and the clear water lines across her thigh, the brand on her shoulder, and for the first time she did not look away. "These don't belong to him anymore," she said quietly. Elias watched her, understanding without needing to answer. The scars were no longer Pike's message. They were hers. As they rested, Elias thought of the church again. He remembered standing behind the pulpit preaching about grace, mercy, turning the other cheek. Those words seemed smaller now, fragile things built for men who had never looked into the eyes of someone branded like cattle. He did not hate what he once was, but he knew he could never return to it. Words alone could not carry the weight of this land or the weight of the cruelty it bred. Action did. Presence did. The choice to stay when running was easier, that was the sermon he now believed in. They moved on. Towns would lie ahead, some suspicious, some welcome and all with their own shadows. Rumors might follow them, whispers about a preacher gone to violence and a girl who had slit a cattle boss open in broad daylight. Maybe more riders would come. Maybe the law paid by men like Pike would decide the graves needed digging again. None of that mattered now. What mattered was the road beneath their boots, the horizon, waiting the fact that two people who should have been destroyed had chosen instead to walk forward. Toward evening, they made camp under a stand of mesquite. Elias built a small fire, careful to keep the flame low. Mara sat across from him, knife in her lap eyes, following the sparks. The quiet stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full of what they had endured and what they refused to surrender. Finally, Elias broke the silence. "You ever think about tomorrow?" he asked. Mara looked into the fire. "I used to think there wouldn't be one. Now, I think it's ours to make." He nodded. Not clean, not easy, but ours. The flames painted their faces in gold and shadow. They weren't saints, weren't bound by vows or titles. They were simply two people who had chosen to fight, chosen to stay chosen, not to let silence win. That was enough. When night fell, they lay side by side beneath the open sky stars scattered endless above them. The land was wide, the future uncertain, but in that moment they felt something close to peace. Not the peace of sermons or law, but the peace that comes when scars stop meaning shame and start meaning survival. Stories like Elias and Mara's remind us that sometimes faith isn't found in words or pulpits. It's found in the choices we make when no one is watching. It's found in refusing to turn away when cruelty carves its mark. It's found in carrying each other through the fire instead of leaving the weak behind. We live in a world where injustice still wears many faces, where power can brand silence and break. But we also live in a world where courage exists in quiet acts, in defiance that says not today, in the decision to walk forward when the past tries to chain us. Elias and Mara weren't saints. They weren't heroes from ballads. They were people scarred and stubborn people who chose action over apathy, resolve over despair. And maybe that's the lesson worth holding. You don't have to be pure to make a difference. You only have to stay, to fight, to believe that scars don't end your story, they begin a new one. So ask yourself, if you were in their place, what would you have done? Would you have turned away or stayed? Tell us in the comments below. Your voice matters. And if this story of survival and grit spoke to you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Whispers of the Wild West, for more tales of resilience, courage, and the untamed spirit of the frontier. Together, we keep these stories alive.